When I started the business, 13 years ago, what my vision was very simple, that we had a transformational event with the advent of the internet. And that was going to all of a sudden allow an education to be delivered to any child in the globe. I mean, you think about it, really for 2 millennia, your educational quality, unless you had large economic means, was limited to geography where you lived. So all of a sudden we had an event that was interactive, that said I can educate a child in a remote village in Africa. And so really K-12 was really founded with that premise, that this was going to be allowed to happen, and what we needed to do was build the systems and the curriculum to allow that to be delivered anywhere. And it was a very exciting time, and I think over the last 13 years, K-12 has become a large company, but I think what I'm most happy with is the fact that I really believe we were a catalyst for all of the things happening in grades K through 12 and online education. Without this entity K-12 going out there and changing laws to get rid of seat time, to have full-time online schools, it really, I think, prompted the districts into action, whether it be to have their own online virtual schools or to offer courses. And I think we were a catalyst more for almost an industry than just a company itself. And I think that has been transformational. Well, I think it's going to follow a couple places. I think one is if you take the video game industry, for example, 20 years ago, a bunch of engineers in a garage could write a video game. Now that's impossible, right? You look at the new versions of Madden football or Call of Duty, they're $100 million projects. I think the learning process is going to go that way, where you're going to see extraordinary amounts of money into very high quality interactive games based on a lot of the latest cognitive neuroscience breakthroughs. So you're going to get curriculum that will engage kids, right? What we've really learned at running schools the last 13 years is the number one most important thing is student engagement. And some children come out of the womb knowing they're going to college. Certainly my own personal children do, right? Before they know what college is, they know where they're going there. But we have to figure out a way to engage those that don't come from that natural level of engagement and support. And that's where technology comes in. How many of these kids are engaged with their games on their iPads or mobile phones? So we have to make education that engaging. And it's a real challenge to do that, because you also don't want to make it inefficient, right? I mean, you can have games like some of the early reading games that you'd spend 8 hours on and you'd learn a single letter. But what I'd like to do is maximize what I call the learning efficiency ratio, which is how much you learn over how much time you spend learning it. And if we combine that concept with engagement, I think we have a way to take student learning to a whole nother level, particularly for those kids who need it the most. He's absolutely. I mean, I never really viewed it quite that way. I always viewed public schools as really a partner, right? So we're here to help public schools in the same way that the defense contractors help the military. These private companies should be there to help them educate students in a better way. And I really think hopefully you'll see transformation happening within superintendents, because if a superintendent asks me what they should be doing of a mid-sized large district, they should be making sure they offer as many different types of education for their district as possible. So you should have an online virtual school. You might want a KIPP Academy type school. You may want a Chinese or Spanish immersion school. And we have to get away from the one size fits all. And by offering more choices, you're more likely to find the education that meets that family needs. And I think a big concept here is, I think the revolution isn't about technology. I think it's about the individualization of education. And technology is a tool to allow that to happen. I mean, we've talked about, those of us in education have talked about differentiated instruction for a long time. But how really possible is that for a teacher with 30 kids in a classroom? Right? Great teachers do a little bit of it, but you just can't do it. It's physically impossible. But you start thinking about a classroom where the computer is delivering a lot of that instruction, and the teacher's a high-valued resource to help kids get over their learning humps, a high-valued resource to lead discussion groups. Well, now individualized learning really does become real, and it goes beyond the classroom. Most high schools can only offer a few electives, but with online learning, you can have thousands of electives. So if you want to come out of high school certified in Oracle, you can. If you want to take 4 years of Chinese and 4 years of Portuguese, you can. And that's empowering. You asked earlier where I think 21st century is going. I'd be surprised if a decade or two from now that high schools in physical brick and mortar teach any electives at all. What they ought to do is concentrate on the core subjects and then let the students take a couple thousand choices of electives online. And you get a side benefit of that is you'll save the country tens of billions of dollars, because if I go to 4 classes in a building, I can double shift high schools. High school, LA is spending $500 million on new high school. You don't need to build another high school for 100 years in this country if you go to that model. So you take it from a student perspective, it's a very powerful. You take it from a school district taxpayer, it's very powerful. So it just needs to happen, right? It's not a question of, if it will happen. It has to happen. The benefits are too good for every constituency involved. It's interesting. It's changed over time. In the early days, there weren't a lot of people with educational experience other than people actually working out of public school systems. So we found them from everywhere. We found them from, I look at some of our best heads of schools. Some of them were, middle management at big companies. Some came out of the public school system, and I think what you really had were people who wanted to make a difference. And they had some skill set, either managerial or education, that allowed them to be successful. As time has gone on, there's more people with that kind of experience. So we now may find people who are working in charter school environments. Once in a while, someone who's working in an online environment. But I still think people with great management experience in corporations, if they're willing to put the time in and learn, can become very effective. We've gotten a lot of good people out of joint MBA, Masters of Ed programs. Right. I think that degree really works for. And I would say 3 or 4 of the best people at K-12 came out of a singular program that does that. And I often go to business schools and ed schools and guest lecture a course once a year, and that's a great recruiting tool. I think every year we get somebody out of that class who wants to come, who's really talented. So I think you find them everywhere. Eventually, I think it'll get a big enough industry where you'll be hiring more like a typical industry does. But I think if you have the passion for helping kids, you can make it work if you have either the education skill sets or the management skill sets.
How does that work?
Boy, that's a great question. I think people are born with an entrepreneurial tendency, right? And I think there's a lot, seriously, when I read the Steve Jobs biography and some of these entrepreneurial biographies, I see so much similarities in them and also the way I think I naturally am constituted for whatever reason, right? But I think, the key, as an entrepreneur, I think you have to be able to see things that others don't see, right? I always say a real entrepreneur, doesn't see the world the way it is or the way it should be, but the way it has to be, right? Because it's very difficult to start something from nothing. So you have to have such a confidence in your vision that it has to be that way, right? And you're going to drive to that. And I think, if one thing made K-12 successful, it's a culture of perseverance. We were knocked down, sued by various entrenched groups, and we never let it demoralize it. Personally, it energized me. And it just made me want to come in and do it more, and that's a different kind of personality. But I think the most important thing is you have a clarity of vision of what you're trying to achieve, and you have a business model that can work, right? I see a lot of people with passion, because I look at a lot of startups, and most of them lack a clearly defined business model or a lack of understanding of exactly how the distribution of educational products and services works. And so it's a hard thing. There haven't been a lot of large companies that were created. I think out of all the companies that were kind of formed in the last, I'll call it bubble, which was kind of 98, 99, 2001, the only 2 that became large companies are Blackboard and K-12. So out of the hundreds or thousands, it's hard, right? It's just hard. There's nothing more rewarding, right, than getting letters from parents and letters from students that say, "Thank you, you saved my child." I spoke at 6 of our graduations this year. And have parents coming up to me saying, "You saved my child's life. My child's not going to college. My child was into drugs. And now, I needed my children to work on the family farm, and you saved my farm." Just the things you hear are just stunning. And I don't think there's anything I like more than going out and actually speaking with the students and the people we're actually helping. I just get so energized out of that. And this year was particularly rewarding because we graduated the first students who started online education in kindergarten and finished 12th grade. And they're doing well. The one child in Colorado is our valedictorian. He's got a golf scholarship down to Florida, and he got 5s on his AP test, just stunning. But when you think he was born basically when the internet was commercialized in '95, and he did his whole education online, it was just, it's almost hard to imagine that back in 2000 when I was speaking to prospective parents. But what was interesting was when I spoke to those parents back in 2001 in the spring, the number one question I got asked of prospective kindergarten through second grade parents was, if I do this for all 13 years, can my child get into a good college? That was the number one question of parents of kindergartners. And the answer was like taking a little entrepreneurial liberty, of course. But the reality is now we're seeing that. So I think that's going to help a lot with the mainstream of education, as we've seen kids go through the whole system and they're socially normal, they're academically doing well. And we provided them an education that they couldn't have got otherwise. And they're happy, right? Well, that gets back to the individualization. I think, education is one of the flaws historically has been, we really have a one-size-fits-all model. And back in 1950, when 80% of the jobs in this country were unskilled labor, it was okay to do that because you didn't have to serve 100% of the kids. Today, it's less than 20% are unskilled labor, and you can't really lead a middle-class life anymore without a good education. So it's not acceptable to teach one size fits all. You have to get the kids on the borders. So if we can individualize education, both through how we teach in the classroom, offering online electives, creating supplemental education to remediate kids, the high school dropouts, if they have the flexibility to take a lot of their courses online, I think we could cut that high school dropout rate in half just by that alone. So let's get down to the individual level and make it to you, right? Let's say, you, young John Smith, you want to become a veterinarian. You're in 6th grade. Here's everything you need to do for the next 7 years to be prepared to be a veterinarian. And here's where you go to college and Let's lay it out for you, what great parents do anyway. Let's figure out how to do that systematically for every child. So it isn't a one-size-fits-all model. And that's what I mean by that. And technology allows you to do that. Well, that's exactly it. And in fact, I argue in order to do best, you almost have to be running a business, because the hard and beautiful thing about what K-12 is if we don't deliver a product/service that customers want, we go out of business. It's a tremendous forcing mechanism. It makes you treat customers better. It makes you innovate. It makes you improve your product every year. Compare that to a school in a town where there's one school. They're not going out of business. The state's not shutting them down. The customers have nowhere to go. So the marketplace is a brutally efficient forcing mechanism to deliver value for customers. And I have to deliver, K-12 has to deliver something the customer wants. If not, we go to business. So I think, they're not against each other. They're actually for each other, right? And one of my favorite, expressions I've always said is, I'm not aware of a single instance in the history of mankind where competition has done anything but deliver the customer more value. And so as we introduce that element into the equation here, the customers just win, right? They just win. And there's no better example of that than the split up of AT&T. Right? I mean, AT&T thought the worldwide demand for cell phones was like 1,000. But once you unleashed broke up the monopoly and allowed competition, long distance phone calls are now free. Right? You have, how many different types of cell phones can you buy? I mean, it was illegal to put an answering machine on a telephone wire. So there's no better example than telephony of what happens is when you break up a monopoly, introduce competitive forces. And I think education will benefit from that. Nobody will be harmed from that who's a customer. Right? There may be existing entities that don't have the same value, the same franchise they have today. But the students will be better off by having more choices and having people compete to deliver what that student needs.